Hi guys, Mark Jones, Blackstain Carpentry. Last time we left off, I sprayed nitrocellulose lacquer on this guitar. It's got a nice gloss finish, but we're going to go from gloss to matte in this video. Why are we doing that? Well, we're going to end up polishing it to a super high gloss finish after this. So here we are with all the lights. This is the current finish that's on here now. It's not perfectly smooth, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start with 400 grit wet dry sandpaper, and we're going to move through as high of grits as we can. 1000 wet dry, 2000 wet dry, and the highest I have is 3000 wet dry sandpaper. I've got this sanding block that I'm going to use by 3M. I don't really like it. I'd rather a piece of wood, but that's what I had. This soft used sanding pad. Oh, and I might use these Scotch-Brite pads on the curve, plus maybe a super white pad. The main thing you're going to use, though, and need is some water with a little soap in it. Oh, and I guess I used a pair of scissors, too. Here I got a shot, just a reminder of where we're at. I left this to cure for about a week and a half before I even thought about sanding it again. Here I am sanding it, getting ready to sand it at least. I'm always going to start with the back first because it's nice, easy, flat. The other side has a cove that it's a challenge of itself. It wasn't too bad. I'll tell you more about what happened when we get there. You use the sanding block because the sanding block will make it level out. That's what we're doing. We're flat sanding it, level sanding it. And any ridges, any bumps, they'll be all hit at the same point, keeping it on the same level. There's a little bit of buildup starts on the sanding block, which is fine. That's what you want. It's called a slurry. Occasionally you'll want to clean that off if there's too much buildup, but the wet dry sandpaper lasts pretty long. I spend my most time on this 400 grit. You can immediately feel the difference. I spend the most time on the 400 grit because that does the most work flattening, because there's the most ridges and imperfections on the first coat. What you want to do is you want to take all of those imperfections out, and you're going to have it as smooth as possible. It'll literally be like a piece of plastic when it's done. That's how smooth it'll be. I'm fairly aggressive with the 400 grit. It's the beginner grit. I'm aggressive because, it takes a little while. See, occasionally you got to clean off Occasionally you're going to want to clean off the slurry just to see your progressions of where you are. You can tell it flattens down pretty quick as you're doing your work on sanding this. The more you sand, the more gloss will come out of the sanding. With 400 grit, you really want to be thorough and make sure you cover every square inch, square centimeter, square millimeter, whatever form you use for measurement. Splitting this up in a couple different days, I ended up doing the top once already. I show you later on how I end up doing the top. So I started with up and down. Now I'm going to go side to side, because the trick with that is if you go up and down, it leaves a sanding pattern. So that's why you go side to side, so it covers up that sanding pattern that you previously had, and you can tell your progress throughout. Occasionally clean off your work. Immediately you feel the difference between the two grits. Now, you can tell in person. I don't think you can really tell in this video, but if you hold it down to a light, you can tell the different sheens that you get from each sanding pattern. It's pretty cool in my opinion. You don't have to spend as much time on this grit, but just make sure you completely cover your sanding pattern. So now I end up using this foam sanding block that's used. It's a garbage sanding block, but I keep it just for this, the little cove on here, because it flattens out the sandpaper. It's better than having just the spot of your finger with the sanding paper on it. I'm on the edge. I just keep the flat line. That's all that needs to happen. Adding a little more water if it's getting tough to sand. Now, the water and soap, it's just a lubricator so that the sandpaper doesn't stick, and it doesn't stick the finish to the sandpaper as much. I started with the 400 grit. This is the 1000 grit now, and man, you can really tell the difference. There's definitely still imperfections all along the way. If there's one spot that's lower than the rest, and you can tell the lower spot from the higher spot because you still see a gloss. The sheen is not exactly the same. Now, all you do is you go as far as you can, but you don't want to stay there forever. So what I ended up doing was I did end up advancing to the next highest grit, but I spent more time in that area than any other area. But if I stayed with, say, the 400 grit in one area the whole time, then I would have low spots all over the guitar. And then as I started to use the other grits, you would slowly sand through the finish, and that would not be good. And you'd almost have to redo the entire guitar. You actually would have to redo the entire guitar. Occasionally clean off to check your progress. You can start seeing a little bit of a sheen on there, not as much. For the top, back to this soft sanding pad. And every time I do this, when I change grits, I end up using a different rag to clean my work surface because I don't want the particles from, say, the 1000 to mix with the particles from the 2000 grit. Another thing, I always use a water bottle. I like the water bottles with the cap that you can squeeze real easy because not as much water comes out of them. But I end up using a water bottle every single time because if I use a bucket, I end up dunking my sandpaper into the bucket, and you have to continually change your water because you don't want the sanding particles to mix with the other sanding particles of the next highest finish sandpaper. The sides were tricky, but they were kind of easy to sand. It was just tricky because you could only do so much of an area at a time, and the bevel by the neck where your hand goes, that was the hardest part by far because it's such a tight corner. I ended up going all the way up to 3000 here. As you can tell, this is another day. I took my time with this. I wasn't rushing it. All in all, on my footage, it was a full hour worth of sanding. So I could have done it all in one day, but my arm was getting tired throughout and whatnot. So I ended up just, taking my time with it. I was being real methodical and making sure if there were any. This is why you don't want any drips, because any drips you're going to have to spend longer in a certain area. There was a small run that was right there that was really annoying, but I ended up finishing with my 3000 grit sandpaper. I wanted to finish going with the grain of the wood. It's not necessary because you're sanding just the finish, you're not sanding the wood. It's just best practice, in my opinion, to finish with the grain of the wood. So here I am. This is it sanded to 2000 grit. I'm about to sand up to 3000 grit. So you could already see a shine coming pretty good, but as you'll be able to tell, there'll be a really big shine with the 3000 grit, and that's before I start polishing it. What you're doing is you're burnishing the finish. That's what you're doing with these different sandpapers. So what you do is, kind of in a review, you end up sanding your wood before you add any finish as high as you can go, somewhere like 220, 320. You add your finish in multiple coats, and then when it's time to sand, you start about where you left off. So I believe I sanded this guitar to 320 with regular sandpaper and my orbital sander, and now I started with 400, 1000, all the way 2000, 3000 grit sandpaper to burnish the finish. Burnishing, you burn the finish into itself, which makes it extremely smooth and desirable to touch. You don't have to do this with lacquer. You could do it with almost any finish, but it's most commonly done with lacquer because lacquer is easy to wet sand. For example, I would not do a polyacrylic and wet sand it. I would just sand a polyacrylic as high as I possibly could with regular sandpaper. You can wet sand a polyurethane, though, which is an oil-based poly, also as high as you possibly can with a water type sandpaper. And here we go. I'm all done. This is sanded all the way up to 3000. Now, around the ring of the pickups, it's going to get covered, so I wasn't too worried because there was an unusual buildup on the pickups. But this guitar is pretty cool. You can tell just in different lights, it almost changes color. See how it's like almost a black here? And then when the light changes, it goes almost to an auburn. I don't know, it's very cool. This is kind of what I was going for, a multicolor look. Now in my next video, I'm going to end up polishing this to a super high gloss. As you can tell, you can really see almost a mirror-like finish just by sanding up to 3000 grit in the lights. But if you think there's anything else that I could have done differently, let me know in the comments. I'm not asking you to like this video, but I would like you to subscribe just because you could follow this build alongside me. Once again, this is Mark Jones, Black Stain Carpentry. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.